I'm not Donald Clark. I think I'm 10 years younger than Donald. I haven't made multi-millions by selling Epic. And I won't upset you. Well, I probably will upset you, actually. Donald is a real hand grenade thrower, and I know Donald. And Donald and I chatted about this via Facebook this morning. Quick chat via Facebook. And as he was stuck in Brighton and the snowy waste of East Anglia, Sussex, it amazes me the fact that Shunfield Airport can be kept up, open in -25, and we closed Gatwick with a little bit of snow. So there we are. If you read my bio, which was not written for this, it was written for a session I'm doing tomorrow on mobile ethics with John Traxler and crew and Steve Wheeler. I want to write a book about what to do when the kit doesn't work, apart from tell jokes. We had one of those moments just now when these poor guys were scrabbling around making their kit work. I want to talk to you about ICT and public spending. And it's very difficult. I'm a public servant with a Conservative MP being my chair, so that's quite an interesting one. Or ex-MP. If we look at the history of investment in ICT and use of it in education and training, it's not a great picture. If you look at some of the EU projects that are being funded under education and training, it's not a great picture. Great story for you. You couldn't make this up. EU-funded project, €7 million for a blogging donkey. If you don't believe me, Google it. And you're on Google now. I am going to massively upset some people in the audience who sell kit. And I know there's some device people out there and hardware people out there. And I'm going to use a very simple thing to explain. We have spent years buying devices for our learners in schools and supporting big infrastructure projects in schools, colleges, universities, the military, education, training, health. I'm going to cover them all. And the fact is, if you look in the case of the UK, the evidence for supporting increases in attainment using technology isn't great. There's some really good evidence about motivation, and there's some really good evidence around social inclusion. But if you look at straight attainment data, it's really quite poor. And we're great in the public sector at picking winners. We're great at it. We're tremendous at it. I'll just show you one device. I'm renowned as a mobile head. You know, I do sleep with my mobile 1.5 meters away from me. I never turn it off. I put it on silent. I tweet on Wi-Fi when my wife is asleep, when I wake up early in the morning. I use it as a torch for finding my way around the house when I have to get up early to leave to get to the airport. I left at 1:45 on Wednesday morning, by the way, when I walked to the airport, and got here on 10 minutes early. Some of you were late for some reason. But the mobile phone is an incredible device. And one of the things that I'm very fond of within mobile phones is text messaging. Does somebody want to guess how many text messages are sent every second in the world in 2010? Anybody want to shout out? 200,000 a second. 6.1 trillion a year. A technology that was, when it was invented, the mobile phone company said they'd never make any money and they could find no practical use for it. Donald Clark, Chris Yap of Microsoft, I've met two very good personal friends of mine, will say predicting technologies, we're great at it. We're rubbish at it. Because it's not the technologies you predict that matter, it's the technologies that you miss. SMS, we missed. The Americans are very slow on SMS. Yeah, Suzanne, you know? I know, yeah. Fastest growing sector of SMS growth outside some of the developing countries is US teens. Something like 3,000 text messages are sent by a US teen, and they only talk 190 minutes a month. Yeah. Some of the Pew data, some of the Nielsen data. It is, you know, but 5 years ago, SMS wouldn't have registered in the US. So I'm making a bit of a cultural statement there as well, actually, because in some parts of the world, our colleagues here from India, huge growth of SMS. Look at the work of some of the work done by Kerala fishermen trying to get the best price for their fish. They will text when they're out at sea, saying, where can I get the best price for my fish? And they will go to that port rather than another. For a technology that the public sector had nothing to do with putting the infrastructure in. Nothing to do with it at all. It's the fastest product take-up in history, after possibly the iPhone and the iPad. Some people in sub-Saharan Africa in the early 80s were more likely to have died without making a phone call than they were to have made one. And in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, penetration of mobiles, John Traxler will tell me the exact data, is in excess of 15–20%. A technology that's probably less than 25–30 years old. I'm not against public spending on ICT, if we spend it wisely. But if we look at some of our offers from some of our existing learning platform providers, any LMS providers in the audience? Come on, own up, put your hands up. They are changing beyond all recognition, and you will not be using the same LMS in 5 years. So why should we, from a public sector, with our huge lead time to projects, invest in things and say this is the best thing since sliced bread? By the time that it's rolled out and it works, and I will speak for myself and England, not the European Union, but I'll speak for myself and England, we have a great history on ICT overspend. And we are great at telling you how successful it is. And you've been great at Educa saying how successful it is. I haven't heard one person here so far talk about what went wrong, and I haven't been to all the sessions, so I apologise. But in fact, the world is full of failure, and we don't share it. The public sector, in terms of education and training, is occasionally one of the worst for not sharing failure. I can tell you, I've tried things, they don't work. I can tell you I've tried using systems that people tell me will work, and I'll make a joke about the conference Wi-Fi. I do apologise, Rebecca. But if you you have a conference, the conference organiser say, yes, the Wi-Fi will work. When you've got 700 or 800 people hammering a Wi-Fi connection, it's not the same as somebody saying you have to test it. It's really difficult. And I couldn't see anybody coming here with 600 or 700 devices to test it. It's really difficult. I want to just pick up, how long have I got? 4 minutes. 4 minutes, that's great. You're falling into my hands, it's fine. I want to finish with just a couple of points, really. I want you to go home when you go home, if you get home on Friday or Saturday, if the snow lets us out. And I want you to do some predictions for 2011, maybe even 2012 if you're brave. Put them in an envelope, put them somewhere. I did a presentation in 2006, I'm going to show it tomorrow morning in my session I'm doing tomorrow morning, about things I predicted. 2006. I did a whole presentation on emerging technologies. Do you know what I didn't mention? 120 points on a mind map. From open source software, hardware, the whole lot. I didn't mention social networking at all. No YouTube. No Facebook. No Twitter. And we are making, as educationists, some real assumptions. And the big assumption we're making is, if you were a young person or an older person, would you want some educationalist invading your Facebook page? Because have you asked them? We're building, but more importantly, if we can build the tools that integrate with Facebook, so if you want to elect to join, you can do. But would you reinvent Facebook?
Yes.
Would you?
I would.
You'd hope to reinvent it. But 500 million users? I'm not sure I believe those figures. 450. I'll give it 450 million. But you just do this, and if you look at that growth, that is a huge growth. But the fact is you shouldn't, as educationists, think you're going to recreate systems like that will be that successful. Because you're very uncool. Especially if you're talking about younger learners. It's interesting having, and I'm going to finish at this point if I may, Harold. Especially when we've got people from the defence industry here. Interesting stuff. If you're really interested in education and training, have a look at some of our colleagues in places like Line, Caspian Learning are doing about immersive education training for people about to be deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're doing stuff that is really quite cutting edge. And we as educationalists, from the school sector, HE, and from training, not from the military, have been very poor at picking up those messages. But basically, why are we bothering investing in capital infrastructure? The market will sort it out for us. Mr. Zuckerberg of Facebook will solve the problem. Now, I'm going to end at that point. But final thing is, you really cannot say that we have, been successful about ICT. Whiteboards, LMS, the next killer application. It's a disaster. If you're a venture capitalist, you'd put no money in any of those because you get no rates in return. You're better off putting it on a horse and gambling with it. Intervention.
Yeah. Sorry, Andy, you couldn't get away with some sort of intervention. I just completely disagree with what you just said. We're talking about education and training, and that's nothing to do with rates of return and money.
Thank you, Paul.
Who's going to pay for it? I'm a huge fan of intellectual advancement. I'm a huge fan of about enabling people. But if you look at the kind of people that we are currently hitting with our educational system, a gentleman this morning talked about that on his keynote about, I think it was Arizona State. The amount of people that end up in university, the amount of people that drop out. There's been a lot of work done. If you stop a young person getting into a cycle of issues of worklessness, areas like that, the amount of money you save for society is huge. But you've got to show a rate of return of investment.
1 minute, Andy.
I'll let him come back to me.
I'm just going back to that illustration we had this morning. Just suppose in some educational paradise, every child in Arizona achieved fantastic grades and they all went to university and got doctorates, then would you drive important things like snowplows around Berlin today?
I'll be very careful what I say here, actually.
Yeah.
I'm just smiling at Harold.
You've got 1 minute.
I'm smiling at Harold here. I do agree with that point. And I think by doing large-scale capital infrastructure projects and using ICT in a certain way, we are pigeonholing. If you look at LMSs, we're forcing young people in a certain route. And we're not allowing for diversity. So I think you've really started to agree with my argument rather than contradict it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Is that all right?
Thank you for that, and thank you for the intervention. We're going to have to move on at a pace, I think, because we're going to be running out of time otherwise. But our next speaker is Suzanne Aurelio, who is from San Diego State University, and she's led a team of key stakeholders who've successfully institutionalized ICTs in teaching and learning. She has an MA in Educational Technology, a PhD in Education, and has taught in the public and private sectors in the US and Europe. Suzanne, to speak against the motion.
Thank you, Harold, with my technology here. Also, ich bin froh, hier in Berlin zu sein. Habe in Deutschland eine lange Zeit gelebt. Where can I put this? So. All right. I hope to provoke you, and hopefully I'll have enough time to do it the way I plan to do it. The French social theorist Jean Baudrillard once said, "Disneyland exists so that the rest of America seems real." Now, I live in Southern California, and Disneyland is not very far away. Our world, he said, is one of simulations. And I'm simulations with a big S, not game simulations. Simulations, hyperreality, he called it. Right? The inability of consciousness, the inability of perception, I would say, to distinguish reality from fantasy. Who's in Second Life? To distinguish the authentic and the original from the fake and the copy. Mashups, who cares? You know, intellectual property rights. The symbol from its referent, of course, that's McLuhan, right? Fact from fiction, and my favorite, and what's going to be the subtext of my argument, is the legitimacy of our fictions. So I'm going to hopefully, and I apologize for those of you that are non-native speakers, I'm going to be playing with language here because I think our discourses is what this is all about. It's been said that our era, the zeitgeist, is one of incongruities, hyperboles, all kinds of exaggerations, I won't use that word, pageantry, and I'm thinking of the German word, spectacles. And I'll give you an example of this. And my favorite one, of course, and if you read postmodernism, it's called, we're living in a time of irony, utter irony, right? I'll give you an example. Elizabeth Warren, who is a law professor at Harvard, heads the Congressional Oversight Committee of the Troubled Relief Assets Program. That's the $700 billion that the American government gave the banks to fix our messed up economy. In an interview a couple of years ago, right after everything crashed, and you can see this interview on YouTube, she was asked, well, you oversee the Oversight Committee, so what did they do with the money, you know? And she said in her very easygoing way, she said, well, we don't know. Nobody asked that question. That was it. Nobody asked the question. Isn't it ironic? Isn't it ironic that our public discourses and this particular question, the questions in this particular motion, are posed in such a way that it doesn't really reflect the other kinds of questions that are asked and not asked in our public discourses. I'm going to focus on one question that was published in the motion, and that is, why is educational achievement stagnating as public spending increases? Because I think if we talk about the failure of the public sector, we're always talking about that spending versus, well, why are students not able to read? Why can they text, but they can't write a paragraph, and all of that. We all know that, and I'm not going to go into that. My position on this, and my thoughts, and I believe this, some days I don't believe it as much as others, is it's all about the neoliberal ideologies that are influencing our discourses. It's about the rhetoric of the marketplace dictating our policies and practices. You know, if you're paying attention to the news, and my argument's going to pull a lot of data from the United States, the new chancellor of the New York City school system, who was recently appointed, is a media executive. She has no experience or expertise in education, educational policy, or educational leadership. What is she doing? Running a big, huge...
Some may view that as a potential advantage, I feel, actually.
Okay, well, let me see. Now, who runs does anybody work in another industry? I mean, I'm going to go then apply to go run Volkswagen then. Geez, you know, I drive a car. I should be able to run Volkswagen, right? And then we have a lot of talk in the publics, or in our public conversations about, in the States at least, about connecting teachers' salaries to students' test grades. I don't get that. And then here in the UK, a couple of weeks ago, and still ongoing, students and pupils took to the streets, right, saying, hey, you're cutting our services and you're increasing the fees and we don't like it. And one student said, and I quote, you know, education is being reframed as a benefit to the student rather than being in society's interest. And that's why I work in public education. That's why I work in public education, because public education is a social institution. Right? It's not a business. You know, that's what Bill Gates thinks it should be. It's not a business. But I'm going to just keep reiterating the question and sort of trying to answer it on and on and on. So why is public spending increasing? Now, many researchers have looked at this in a real research way and said, well, you know what? It's not the amount of money. It's how we spend it. And I can agree with that. You know, in my office, we could work a little faster. Paper could move from one desk to another desk a little faster. I agree. I have no qualms about that. But I've got an answer how we could reduce public spending in higher education in the United States overnight. Get rid of college football. And I know this is not something that, even if you're not living in the United States, and I'm not aware that other nations represented here have college football, but let me give you some data here, okay? Last year, 2009, okay, California was in a major budget crisis. I mean, salaries were cut, people were let go, they're living on the street. It's ugly in California. Last year, 2009. San Diego State signed a new 10-year lease to rent out the city football team where the big football team plays. This lease will cost $95,000 per football game. It used to cost $50,000. I won't get into why they raised it, anyway. But an interesting fact along with that is that attendance to these football games dropped from 28,000 to about 17,000, that was in 2004, to about 17,000 in 2008. $95,000 a football game for 17,000 people to go and drink beer and all of that. Okay, another interesting tidbit about college football. Our assistant football coaches' salaries jumped 60% between 2005 and 2009. In 2009, that assistant football coach salary combined was $1.24 million. Now, let me put this into perspective for you what the rhetoric and the discourse around this particular issue is. And I'm going to quote from the director of the College Sport Resource Institute at North Carolina. He said, "In our society, ask the folks at Bank of America and Merrill Lynch. We often measure a person's talent by how much they are paid, not by what they accomplish. I think the rationale for lavish spending on coaching salaries in college football is similar to former Merrill Lynch CEO John Staines' logic in paying huge bonuses. He did it because he thought he could." Now, there's something really incongruent there for me. There's something fantasy-like, something Disneyland-esque for me in that particular statement. Okay, so why is public spending increasing and educational achievement is stagnating? Football has nothing to do with it. I might anger some people here because it's about technology spending. I got to tell you guys, it's about technology spending. We construct the fictions. Remember I said I'm going to be talking about fictions. We are constructing fictions about the effectiveness of technology. And then we publish them in our journals, and then we cite them and cite them and cite them, and then we blog them and comment, and then we tweet and retweet them, and then we slide share them and YouTube them, and on and on and on. It's about the discourse. It's about the expectations of the discourse. Theodore Roszak is a historian professor, and he is very critical of ICTs. I recommend anybody reading some critique of ICTs. I think his book was published in the 80s or the 90s, I'm not sure. It's a historical perspective. In any event, it's called The Cult of Information. And he said, we are just so in love with technology and science. We just think it's going to solve all of our problems, right? A more recent book, written by Jaron Lanier. It's You Are Not a Gadget. I think it was written last year. Jaron is a computer scientist, an internet guru, one of those visionaries who started everything in Silicon Valley. He was one of those guys who said, yeah, this is going to revolutionize everything. He said, Web 2.0 is about mob mentality. It's about the hive mind. It's anti-intellectual. Right? It's about ideologies. It's about a freedom that doesn't exist for everybody. We're spending money on technology, and educational achievement is stagnating because we function on faulty assumptions. We've invested billions, and teachers are not. Yes?
I don't know if I altogether agree with you. I also work for a government agency. But to me, what's happening is that the people at the top don't get it. And because the people at the top don't get it, the people at the top are the ones that actually make the decisions. So they listen, they believe all this hype. Certainly in further education and in schools, anything that says ICT on it gets fed further down the food chain. It goes to the ICT coordinator, who isn't actually privy to what's going on at the top. So you end up with no integrated strategy. And I think ICT could deliver if we actually integrated it. And what the public sector does is put it in a little box that says, ICT, that's over there, that's not our job.
Yes, I agree. I agree, and I have just about a minute, so I will jump to...
Can I just interject?
Yes, you can.
Briefly. You're not selling me a vision.
I'm not selling you a vision. I'm selling you a dystopian vision.
Well, I think...
Do you want a vision?
I think, if you're so fine that we should spend a fortune on ICT and training and large capital infrastructure projects, which we're talking about as well, you've got to have vision, and I don't see a lot of vision in your justification.
Okay.
With all due respect.
He's got a minute to outline your vision.
Yeah, I don't have a vision. I don't have a vision because I don't think that's my role. But I understand what you're talking about, and I actually worked on a project that formulated a vision, a realistic vision that made an impact on our school. We started off with, to answer your question, we started off with doing a faculty development program because it's just what you said. It's ICT, it's sort of at the top, it goes to the bottom. We don't think about organizational issues. We don't think in terms of organizational development, capacity building, building a critical mass of key stakeholders that are going to slowly change, if you want a vision, to slowly change over time the culture of higher education, which as a social institution is, besides the church, the oldest unchanged social institution in Western society. And I don't think anybody would disagree with that. It's going to take some time, and I think we need to work at a very slow pace and change the culture through getting people involved. Yes?
I just think we've had so many projects and so many pilots. We've got more bloody pilots than EasyJet and Ryanair and BA all added up together.
Yeah, you're right. We're always pilot testing. I mean, in the States, we're always pilot testing. I can't agree with you there. So when are we going to commit? And, well, this is where I could go off on the vendors, because I've got vendors calling me right and left wanting to basically change the technology every 3 months. You can't, as an institution, commit to one technology, particularly if it's an infrastructure technology, and then know that it's going to be there, know that the company's going to not be insolvent, right, in 2 months or 3, or it's going to get bought up and service is going to change. Lots of really dicey issues that I think the private sector really adds to. So I got pulled off mine. So just to sum up, I guess I will say that there are. I think we are dealing with a lot of myths, and I think the sooner that we, or not the sooner, but the more that we're able to have conversations like these where we can use ICTs and criticize them and then circle it around to solutions, right? Not just criticize and leave it, but circle around to solutions, we can maybe get at some of those more sensitive issues about culture change, about generational differences and whatnot. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Suzanne. Our next speaker is Alan Bruce, who is a Director of Universal Learning Systems, an international consultancy in research, education and innovative learning, and ULS operates in Ireland, the Czech Republic, United Kingdom and Finland. That's his private sector interest. His public sector interest is that he's also a senior research fellow with the University of Edinburgh, and he has lectured in universities in France, England and Ireland, and also worked in policy research for the European Commission. So he straddles both sides of the fence in a way, but we're not necessarily holding anyone who speaks to their remarks. They may be saying things that they don't necessarily believe 100% of the time. But Alan is going to speak for the motion.
I'll do this the traditional way from the podium, so I can actually see things. And I'd like to start off, Andy and I were just saying, to thank Suzanne for making our case for us so wonderfully. I think that the points that Suzanne has raised are important ones and critical ones, but they go to the core of this motion. And what we are talking about, yes, is the legitimacy of fictions. And what greater fiction is there at the moment in our societies on both sides of the Atlantic than that the public is still public? Our point is that the public sector has failed because the public sector has walked away from its responsibilities and from what it's supposed to be. So the argument is not, therefore, whether we are talking about characterizations or caricatures of private and public. And since I straddle both, I can speak with some degree of authenticity. That we have a rapacious, profit-making private sector with no sense of what learning is about, no sense of ideas around empowerment or personal growth. We have a public sector which is sclerotic and contaminated by its own incompetence and inefficiency. We have a mix of both, because underneath public and private is society. And our society probably also is becoming somewhat of a fiction. We've heard a lot about the US focus, rightly so. And having endured the first 19 years of my life with American football teams, I hear what you're saying. But in the latter part of my life, and having gone through many other things, this is now something which is global. And here we come to the vision thing, to quote somebody else, now long gone. This conference, in every session I've been to, in every breakaway session, in every private discussion, has had a whisper in the background. And this has talked about real concerns and issues that we have when we look at technologies and the applications of technologies. And that little whisper is why? What are we doing? And why? What is our strategy on ICT and its application is dependent on something which comes before. And that is dependent on policy. So what is our policy about our strategy? What is our policy about education and learning? And that policy in turn, here's the rub, is based on values. What do we actually stand for? And part of our argument in supporting this motion is that the public sector has lost sight of its values. It has become contaminated. It lacks direction, it lacks understanding, precisely because it no longer has a sense of values. In my work, in my training, in my background, I am a voice from the margins. My entire career has been spent working with difference, working with those marginalized from the mainstream, working first in the area of disability, later on in the wider area of social exclusion, and currently primarily in the area of ethnic minorities and participation in this best of all possible worlds. And in that work, technology became useful to me in both public and private spheres because it provided the opportunity with intelligent application to make a bridge between the needs of the learner and the rights of the citizen. And I think this is no time to apologize for a focus on rights, because again, this is something which in the public sector we are beginning to see occluded by other realities. I'm also a voice from a geographic margin. Despite growing up in California, I realized at some point, in a quixotic sense of adventure, my parents and family had come from Ireland and I moved there at the age of 19. Wasn't that a wise career move? And I fast-forwarded into a society on the cusp of modernity. And to look back at that Ireland of the mid-1970s and to look at the Ireland of 2010, boy, it's been some roller coaster. And probably let's have another voice from that context of modernity, of James Joyce. River Run past Toth starts off Finnegan's Wake, and where Joyce, that great siren voice of what was happening to the 20th century, says at one point, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken. And I think in many ways what our public sector has become itself has become a nightmare of confusion and lack of direction. But also, and I would like, Harold, to pay thanks to the IMF and to the European Central Bank for giving me the opportunity this week of all weeks to stand as the citizen of a country which is experiencing at first hand the nightmare of neoliberalism full tilt. And the reality of a country touted by, again, a European public sector as the example to the rest of Europe of progress and learning and high tech, now finds itself in a financial shambles, not necessarily caused by its own incompetence, although about that I could really wax eloquent. So where is the public sector in all this? And what is the connection to what we talk about with advanced technologies? Well, I think we need evidence. I think we need evidence of what has been done. And as we look for this evidence around policy and direction, we see confusion. We see inappropriateness. We see, as one of the speakers said, mile upon mile of reports and pilot studies and experiments and very gently testing the water, but we don't see a fire in the belly sense that this is important because learners are important. No other reason is necessary. But when we lose count of that, we lose count of accountability. So let me just give one little point from an Italian philosopher and political activist writing in the early 1920s, Antonio Gramsci. He said, "The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now, it's the time of monsters." So I would think that one of our fictional animals to traipse across the stage would be the monster. And I think very much, therefore, we need to look at the public sector application here and our contention of why it has not worked. It's because there is a public sector operating at a time of systemic failure. The failure to use ICT effectively, which is the case that Andy and I would advance in education and training, is based on reasons. And I think that this is a conceptual failure to understand the needs of the people for whom this technology and indeed learning is designed. I think it is no accident that the growing public sector distance from the public is manifested in many ways. A fixation with organizational restrictions, the constant sense of cannot do, the sense of trying to graft in these wonderful technologies to a pre-existing system which itself is way past its best before date. So in many of the sessions I've been at this conference, I've heard teachers expressing concerns. Yes, we'd like to use the technology, but first, what about my job? What about my security? I was brought up all my life to feel that ghosts of the past show what insecurity means to a teacher. Is this to say that our teachers are incompetent, they need to get real, move into the cut and thrust of the lair of the private sector? Far from it. It's to reassert the importance of the visionary role of teachers as leaders. But how can we do that when we cut their pay, when we cut their resources, when we tell them day after day, you're lucky to have a job. A job at any price is not worth having. What do we value? I live in a country which in this week of financial collapse turns around and cuts the salaries of its teachers by 10%, refuses all new capital expenditure in schools, cancels Christmas, well, not that far, and also turns around and says that for the non-pay people in schools, they will also endure a cut and there will be a freeze in employment. This is a stark message to the future. It's a stark message to the private sector sharks, and luckily we're not here to argue the benefits of the private sector, but to talk about the failures of the public. It's a failure of real nerve. Yes?
I can't help feeling that what you're doing is only addressing the first part of the motion. This House believes the public sector has failed. Full stop. You haven't talked about the ICT that is being used effectively in the public sector. You might argue the public sector isn't the one that's doing the using, but you yourself have said when you were working in the public sector, you used ICT, and I'm pretty sure you agree you use it effectively.
But that's another story. Some of us, you see, I think that, yes, I think there is a blend between these things. And I don't think it's black and white. I think this is part of the crippling intellectual straitjacket that many people in the West have. It's one or the other. Why not an intelligent combination of both? Can the public sector succeed? Yes, it's precisely my point. But let me continue. Let me quote a Slovenian philosopher, Slavoj Žižek. Both private and public are being redefined by systemic crisis. We now live in a permanent economic state of emergency. And I think perhaps this is a more eloquent response to what you're saying, is that both private and public are being torn by something bigger than us, something which is really quite critical. And therefore, I think in trying to look at our advocacy of the public sector failing in so many ways, does it fail all the time? Obviously not. But let's try and pick out what's good here. But we are looking at a time of crisis, we're looking at a time of profound and sustained change, and we're looking at the echoes of globalization going through at every possible level. So let's see where we can go with this. I too would like Suzanne to quote a philosopher. And I'm aware of where I am, and I'd like to talk about Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant, in writing in his essay on what is the Enlightenment, an essay well worth rereading, talks about the public use of reason and the public appropriation of reason to do good things based on a public awareness, which leads to commonality and to sharing. He also talks about the private use of reason. He does connect them, but he does draw a distinction. And I think it would be appropriate for us to look at that and to see how we can begin to move forward. I think in the use of ICT, there's been institutional resistance from the beginning. This is not a new thing. If we look back in the 1920s, we can see the evidence of people who talk about motion pictures, which would replace the classroom. And again, it didn't happen. We see later on in the 30s and 40s the touting of radio as the solution, again to replace the classroom. Again, our Western dualism, the sense of either or. The sense of television and its potential coming throughout the 50s and 60s. At each point of technological advance, we have had the sense that somehow it can replace the classroom without us asking the fundamental question, not about the technology or about the deficit of the learner, but what is wrong with the classroom. The classroom, which is based on an industrial model of preparation, of schooling, and I think this probably is a time to bring back into the discussion the insights of Ivan Illich. 40 years later, his comments on technology and application and empowerment still stand as true as the day they were written. I think we need to take learners into account. I think we need to realize that, and this is not something which is exclusive to the private sector, and perhaps I can answer some of your concerns, but I think we need to take risks. We take risks as educators who know what we're doing. And very often, knowing what we're doing is knowing that we can make mistakes, as Andy said, that we can err, but we can learn from our mistakes because we're human. I think if I can give 3 quick examples, I'd like to refer to some of the work we have done in Ireland.
If you wouldn't mind making it fairly brief, Alan, because we're running out of time, so 3 minutes.
I will make it very, very brief, okay? In Ireland, I think we have had a revolution in education in the last 30 years. And I think this has come from the public sector, but also with the public sector grappling with the elephant in the room, is that the previous existing schooling system was controlled by the churches and by one particular denomination at that. I'm talking here about the Republic, although the lessons apply as well to Northern Ireland. But I think what is interesting in this, and speaking just before this, is that one thing that did happen was the revolution in the primary curriculum. A curriculum which is child-centred, which is empowering, which is exploratory, where technology is used and used at an extremely advanced level. My 2 daughters were quite amazed in a recent trip to Prague to see chalk and see a blackboard. They had never seen it before. Okay, it's caused consternation to my colleague there. We found at the university level, and a question for institutes of technology, again an exploratory sense of experiment and learning. But we left untouched the secondary phase, that 12 to 18 group. We left a terminal examination imported from elsewhere. We negate all the good we do by not thinking, shall we say, adventurously enough. And I think this is the critical thing. I also had other things to say, but I feel I'm under pressure time-wise, about France and vocational training, where we have also worked, but in a system where it wasn't thought through, where the technological advances designed to be applied in the sector around disability were completely negated by the lack of a common coherent vision of what it meant for people with disabilities to take their place in society. And finally, with this school in Greece, where I'm working, a private school that can take risks and do things, and buck the trend of most Greek schools because it actually has a name instead of a number. Our point, and the argument we'd like to make, is that the public sector has failed because the public sector has abandoned its public responsibilities. I think it's important, therefore, that both public and private disentangle from each other. This is a false argument. re-engage, get the best of both. But at the end of the day, our motion still stands. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. I see that we are now getting the tweets through, so if you want to let us have your tweets or Twitters, they're now coming through, and you'll see them on the screen behind me there, and the details of where to send them are also down at the bottom of the screen. We now move to our final speaker, Richard Straub, who is the Secretary General of the European Learning Industry Group, but he's also spent a large part of his career in senior positions working for IBM, and he recently, in 2008, also founded the Peter Drucker Society of Austria, which became the Drucker Society Europe. Richard.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, you all realize we are here in a city where this discussion may be particularly pertinent. Why is this so? We are in Berlin, and the modern education and research university has come from Berlin. The name Wilhelm von Humboldt will tell you something, I'm sure. And not only the university, but also what the Germans call Bildungsideal, the education ideal, I don't know how to best translate it, which comprised all the phases of education, primary, secondary, and tertiary education. I'm saying that for a very simple reason, because I think in this discussion we should not lose the view on the bigger context. The context is much, much bigger than ICT. And I will relate to this in many ways. The question on my mind, and I think which should be on the mind of those who make decisions in our society, is not so much about ICT as such, but whether public sector education institutions are doing a good job in fulfilling their mission in society. ICT is a tool. It's a very important tool. We agree. You've heard I've been in IBM for many years, so I will not argue against that. But it remains a tool. If you line up all the elements which make up a successful education system, you find many, many more. And I don't need to repeat them, like quality of teachers, the research levels, facilities, curricula, etc., etc. Hence the first question on my mind, and now taking a European perspective, you have heard a US perspective, now you get a European perspective, is whether in Europe the education system is fulfilling its fundamental mission, which in some way is providing skills, competencies that are needed in our society. The question is, how do we make our society function? And a base layer of this functioning, obviously, is the education system. I would say, while things are never perfect, I would also argue that Europe is rightly proud about its education system. There are differences by country, there are differences in regions, but if we look with a bit of a distance at the outcomes, I think it's not all bad. Today, examples were given like Finland as a major example, or Germany. And if you measure it in terms of success of our societies, economic success, but also success in the cultural arena and also in public sector, and I will come back to that, I think we don't need to hide. There was prosperity created after World War II in a period, which I think was unprecedented, and the education system played a major role in this. There's, of course, significant room for improvement. But the question I would ask you before you vote, where are the great role models when you look at Europe? Do you see the glass half empty or half full? The education system, in fact, was quite successful in delivering what you could call the raw material to make our societies function. Despite the ambient pessimism, we should not forget that. Now, let me come to the questions about ICT. The advent of ICT, of information and communication technology, is a fairly young phenomenon. Well, last 20 years, we have the internet and the World Wide Web. And I've been in IBM, I've started in 73, and this was just the time when the System 360 came out, the first serious computing system. So in historical terms, we are talking about a blip, about a very, very short period. I will not argue that public sector institutions, education institutions, are the most nimble and the most agile institution, but let me remind you, they have not been designed for this. There was a different design point. They have not been designed to create knowledge via the wisdom of the crowds. To let everyone, they've not been designed to let everybody be a competent knowledge producer without any process to validate the knowledge. They have not been designed for the chatter on Facebook and Twitter and so on. They are guardians of sound knowledge creation and dissemination. And these processes, ladies and gentlemen, have been evolving since the time of Enlightenment and are the basis of our culture, or a significant basis of our culture. Is this all bad? I will not argue that no change in schools or academic institutions is required. But let's not spill the baby with the bathwater. We don't need a revolution. I hear the term revolution so often. I think what we need is continuity and change, combined in a smart way. ICT is a major tool in this change and transformation process, but it will only provide its value if we first know what is it that we want to achieve. The vantage point must be at this level, not at the level implementing ICT. The expectations and the hype of how ICT would instantly transform education were wrong and misplaced. We've gone through all this. The resistance that we encountered at these stages was understandable. However, still, during this period, good things have happened. And we don't need to mention it here, from student information systems, learning management system, open content, textbooks digitized and usable in completely new ways. So it's not like things have not been adopted. But does this mean we have reached the potential of ICT? No, I would not argue that. However, we have an education and research system that we should remember and that we should be proud of. Let's stop bashing public sector education and rather collaborate and listen how ICT can be used to help the education sector achieve its mission in the 21st century. Let's not fall in the trap to have digital natives define the rules of the game. No, I mean, I have nothing against digital natives. They are kids like other kids as well. No sound knowledge without rigor and discipline. The race, as we heard it today, between education and catastrophe is on. Let's make sure we are on the right side. Thank you.